I'm not even sure where to begin, honestly. But hey, since this is Reddit, I'll get straight to the point. Today I got back from a business trip and found a sold sign on my lawn. My stepfather smirked and told me I didn't need a fancy house while he packed his bags for his European tour. I let him board his flight. And when he returned, he had nowhere to go. Before I explain how that happened, let me introduce myself. My name is Ian. I'm 28 years old and I work as a structural engineer. My job pays well, but it's exhausting. I spend more time on construction sites than at home, traveling between projects. The only thing that kept me sane was my house, my own place. Or so I thought, because as of today my house no longer belongs to me. You don't need a house like this, kid. I knew something was wrong the moment I turned onto my street. I had just returned from a 3-week business trip out of state. I was exhausted, having barely slept 3 hours on the plane. All I wanted was to shower and crash on the couch. But when I pulled up to my house, I saw something that turned my stomach. A red and white sold sign staked into my lawn. I braked so hard the tires squealed. My brain refused to process what I was seeing. No, this had to be a mistake. I pulled into the driveway and practically ran to the front door. My work bag still slung over my shoulder. Before I could reach the door, I heard his voice, Richard, my stepfather. He was inside my house packing my things. I burst through the front door, my heart hammering. What is going on, Richard? He barely looked up from the box he was taping shut. Oh, hey, kid. You're back earlier than I thought. He always called me kid. Like I was still some clueless teenager and not a grown man who had worked hard for everything he had. I dropped my bag on the floor. Why is there a sold sign on my lawn? Richard sighed dramatically, as if I were the one inconveniencing him. We sold it. My stomach lurched. Sold it? I took a step closer. What do you mean, sold it? Richard set down the packing tape and looked at me like I was stupid. Your mother and I. We obviously don't need a house this big, Ian. It's ridiculous for someone your age. You should be renting a small apartment, saving money. He waved a dismissive hand. You'll thank me later. I felt my fingers curl into fists. Richard, this is my house. I bought it with my money. You had no right. He actually laughed. Right, kid? You think you achieved this? You think you're some kind of self-made success story? He patted my shoulder condescendingly. It's all family money, shared assets. You don't actually own anything. I recoiled as if he'd slapped me. Family money? Shared assets? That's a lie. How could I feel so sick? My voice cracked. Richard smirked. Oh, don't give me that surprised look. You signed the papers years ago. You really should read the fine print, kid. My hands were shaking. Where's Mom? Richard shrugged. She's in Italy already. Needed a little break. I gritted my teeth. So you sold my house, took the money and left me with what? Nothing. Oh, don't be so dramatic. He grinned, patting my cheek like I was a toddler. You're young. You'll figure it out. He snapped shut an expensive-looking leather suitcase and slung it over his shoulder. Look, I'd love to stay and chat, but I have a flight to catch. 5-star hotels, private tours, the best of the best. First class all the way. I watched him as he walked past me toward the front door. I'll bring you back a nice souvenir, he said, and then he was gone. I stood there paralyzed, staring at the empty space where my furniture, my home used to be. My entire life had been ripped away from me. And what could I do? Nothing. Or so he thought. Richard. I let him board that flight. I let him sip champagne at 30,000 feet, thinking he'd won. But when he landed back home 2 weeks later, he realized something. He had nowhere to go. So where was I? Yes, my house. Gone. My stepfather was sipping champagne in first class, and I was standing in the ruins of my former life, trying not to punch a wall. But I wasn't going to lose my mind. I was going to get my revenge. Ian, you have to see the bigger picture. The first thing I did was call my mom. No answer. I called again. Straight to voicemail. By the third call, I was shaking with rage. Not just because she wasn't answering, but because I already knew. I'd known for weeks, maybe even months, and she hadn't warned me. I sent her a text. Mom, call me. Now. 3 dots appeared. She was typing. Then the message came. Ian, I don't want to talk about this on the phone. We'll talk when I get back. I stared at the screen, my jaw so tight it hurt. After they sold my house behind my back? I called again. This time she answered. Ian, I don't like the tone of your messages. Her voice was calm, distant, as if I were the one overreacting. I gripped the phone so hard my fingers ached. You don't like my tone? I repeated, letting out a bitter laugh. Mom, what the hell is wrong with you? You sold my house. She sighed like I was being difficult. Ian, honey, Richard and I talked about this, and we really think it's for the best. For the best. The phone nearly slipped from my hand. For the best for who? You. For you, she insisted. Honey, you have to admit, a house like that was too much for you. It's expensive, it's big, it's a lot of responsibility. You work so much you barely have time to enjoy it. What's the point of spending money on a place you don't even use? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Mom, I bought that house. I wanted that responsibility. Ian, you're still young. You don't need a huge house at this point in your life. It was what Richard had said. And you know, Richard and I found a much better option for you, a nice little modern condo right downtown. Easy to maintain, affordable, much more suited to your lifestyle. I was speechless. A condo? They stole my house and now she was trying to convince me to settle for a condo? She sighed again like I was being a child. Honey, you have to see the bigger picture. Richard actually helped you. He freed you from all that stress. And listen, we didn't take all the money. Some of it will go toward helping you get that condo. Richard will handle the details when we get back. My stomach churned. And the rest? There was a pause. Then she said, well, some of it went towards our trip. But come on, Ian, it's family money. We all deserve a little happiness. A lump formed in my throat. She actually believed that. She honestly thought they had done me a favor. Legally, he had every right. I spent the next 2 hours going over my paperwork, desperate to find some way to fight this. There had to be something, some loophole, some document, anything that proved the house was still mine. But when I got to the refinancing papers, my stomach dropped. Because there it was, in black and white. Months ago, while I was working out of state, Richard had refinanced the mortgage solely in his name. My name had been removed from the title, making him the sole legal owner. He had done it so quietly, so strategically, that by the time I realized what had happened, it was too late. I read the fine print 3 times, hoping I'd missed something. I hadn't. Legally, he had every right to sell my house. And the money? My next step was to check my bank accounts. Because even though I knew I hadn't received anything from the sale, I needed to be sure. When I opened my banking app, my hands started shaking. Because I saw exactly what I'd feared. A $90,000 deposit from the sale of the house, followed by multiple withdrawals. Hotel bookings, luxury brands, a wire transfer to an international account. It felt like I'd been punched in the gut. The money wasn't just gone, it was spent. But I wasn't done. I sat in my empty house staring at my phone, my chest burning with a rage that felt like it was about to explode. Richard thought he'd won. But I wasn't going to let him get away with this. I took a deep breath. I steadied myself. I made 2 calls. The first was to my lawyer. The second was to my Uncle David. You see, Richard had forgotten one thing. The only reason he had the credit to refinance the house was thanks to my mother. And I knew something she didn't want him to know. Richard was about to lose it all. Let him enjoy his European tour. Let him sip his champagne and think he'd gotten away with it. Because when he landed back home, he wouldn't have a penny to his name. And he was about to learn exactly what it feels like to have everything taken away from you. Okay, Reddit, time for the good part. Richard thought he'd pulled off the perfect scam. He took my house, spent the money, and jetted off to Europe, all while congratulating himself on helping me out. But what he didn't know was that he'd left enough loose ends for me to unravel his entire life. So while he was sipping overpriced wine in Paris, I was setting the stage for his downfall. Step 1, freeze everything. The first call I made was to my lawyer, Sam. I'd known him since college. He wasn't some big shot attorney, but he was incredibly sharp, and more importantly, he hated guys like Richard. After I explained everything, Sam let out a low whistle. God, Ian, he really screwed you over. Tell me about it, I muttered, the thought of them selling my house turning my stomach. But Sam continued, his tone more somber. But if he refinanced the mortgage without your knowledge, we might have something. That caught my attention. How? I asked, hardly daring to believe what I was hearing. Because your name was originally on the title, Sam explained. He told me that if Richard had committed fraud to get me off the title forging signatures, withholding documents, we could sue him. I gripped my fist. Can we prove it? I asked, rage simmering inside me. That's what I'm going to find out, Sam assured me. He promised to review all the records and see if Richard had broken any laws during the refinancing process. If he had, I could take him to court, freeze his assets, and make his life a living hell. Next, I called my Uncle David. Uncle David is my mom's older brother, and he hates Richard. He saw him coming from day one, sensing his fake charm years ago. But my mom ignored his warnings and married him anyway. The minute I told him what had happened, David exploded. That manipulative bastard. You're kidding me. He stole your house. Oh, and wait, there's more, I told him. He used Mom's credit to refinance it. I'm pretty sure she doesn't even know what kind of mess she's in. David cursed under his breath. What do you need me to do? David runs a small accounting firm, and luckily for me, Richard had been using his services for years. He trusted my uncle to handle his taxes, business records, everything. And now David was more than willing to dig into Richard's finances. If there's anything shady in his accounts, I'll find it, David promised, his voice tight with determination. And if he's evading taxes, he's going to have bigger problems than you. I smiled slowly, a dark satisfaction spreading through me. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. For the next 2 weeks, I kept my head down and waited. I didn't call my mom. I didn't message Richard. I let him think everything was fine. Meanwhile, Sam combed through the mortgage paperwork, and David dove into Richard's finances. Then, just 3 days before Richard was due back from his trip, I got 2 calls. The first was from Sam. Bingo, he said, and his tone made me grin. Richard committed mortgage fraud. Apparently, he had forged my signature on some documents to push through the refinancing without my consent. That meant the entire sale of the house was illegal, which meant I could drag him through the courts and utterly destroy him. Send me everything, I told Sam. We're going to take him down. An hour later, David called. You are going to love this, he said, practically giggling. I found undeclared income on Richard's taxes. I straightened. What kind of income? Let's just say he's been hiding money from the IRS for years. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash, all undeclared. If I make the right calls, he's going to have a very serious audit on his hands. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. Make those calls, I said, savoring each word. Richard had taken everything from me. Now it was my turn to return the favor. Richard's flight landed at 4:15 p.m. on a Sunday. At 4:37 p.m., I was sitting in my car across the street from his house, waiting. I didn't have to wait long. A black Uber pulled up and out stepped Richard, decked out in a designer coat and that smug grin I so loathed. I watched him drag his suitcase up the driveway, humming to himself. He looked so self-assured, like nothing bad could ever touch him. He reached the front door, punched in the security code, and nothing. Richard frowned, tried again. Nothing. Then the door opened and there stood my mom. And she didn't look happy. Even from across the street, I could hear their voices. What's wrong, babe? Why isn't the code working? My mother crossed her arms. We need to talk. Richard tried to push past her, but she blocked his way. Not here, she told him. Just let me in, Richard. His voice wavered slightly. The bank froze our accounts. Richard's expression changed instantly. His smug grin vanished. What? I don't know what happened, he stammered. Everything was fine. And this morning I tried to withdraw money, and they told me the account was blocked. Richard's face paled. Then his phone rang. He answered, turning away from my mother, and that's when I saw it. His whole body stiffened and he began to yell. I knew exactly who he was talking to, because the IRS audit notification had just hit his inbox. His tax fraud was exposed, his illegal mortgage was flagged, his entire financial life was imploding in front of his eyes like a house of cards. And he had no idea who had done it. I started my car and drove away, smiling to myself. I could have stayed to watch him lose his mind. I could have walked over, looked him right in the eyes, and told him exactly what I'd done. But I didn't. because the best revenge is letting him realize on his own just how much he'd lost. I lost my house. But Richard, he just lost everything. Okay, Reddit, brace yourselves because here comes the good part. Last we heard from Richard, he just landed back home, only to find his accounts frozen, his tax fraud exposed, and my mother barring him from their own house. He had no idea what was going on, only that his entire financial life was crumbling around him like sand through his fingers. But that was just the beginning. Now it was time to watch him sink. Who did this? I didn't stick around to watch Richard's real-time meltdown. Instead, I drove to my temporary place, poured myself a drink, and waited for the inevitable call from my mother. It didn't take long. At exactly 6:42 p.m., my phone lit up with her name. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times. Finally, I answered. Mom, I said. Her voice was trembling. Ian. Do you know what's happening? I leaned back in my chair, savoring my whiskey. Depends, I replied, feigning calmness. What's happening? She let out a shaky breath. Richard's accounts are frozen. The IRS is investigating him for tax fraud. And the mortgage company says there's a legal dispute over the sale of your house. I feigned surprise. Wow. Sounds like he's having a really bad day. Ian, she snapped, her voice edged with annoyance. This isn't funny. You did something, didn't you? I let the silence hang in the air. Then in a quiet voice I said, You and Richard stole my house. I heard her gasp. Honey, she began, her voice softening. You have to understand, we were thinking about your future. The house was too much responsibility for you. I let out a low, bitter laugh. Responsibility? That's your excuse. Ian, you took everything from me. And now you're upset because Richard is facing the consequences. Ian, she whispered. He's going to lose everything. I smiled. Good. I heard her sharp intake of breath. You're not serious. Oh, I am, I replied. And you know what, Mom? He's not the only one losing everything. Richard had nowhere to go. What happened next, I got from Uncle David, who had a ringside seat to the spectacle of the century. After hanging up with my mom, I texted David. Me, how bad is it? David, bad. He tried to pull money from one of his business accounts. Frozen. He tried calling his tax guy, found out about the IRS audit. Panic. Me, what about Mom? David. She kicked him out. I sat up straight. Me, Mom kicked him out? Seriously. David, yep. She's terrified. Doesn't want to get caught up in his mess. So she changed the locks and told him to solve his own problems. Me, where is he now? David, no clue. But if I had to guess, he's sleeping in his car. I couldn't stop smiling. Richard had spent the last 10 years treating me like some stupid kid who needed his guidance. And now look at him. Homeless, penniless, nothing. Ian, please, we need your help. A day passed, then another. On the 3rd day, my phone rang again. Mom. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times. Finally, I answered. Mom, I said, my voice cold. Her voice was strained. Ian, we need to talk. I set my glass down on the table. About what? She hesitated, then finally spoke. Richard, he's in trouble. He has nowhere to go. He's sleeping in a motel. A motel. I let out a bitter laugh. Wow, what a tragedy. Ian, she pleaded. Please, we need your help. I leaned forward. You need my help? You mean the same kid you said wasn't ready to own a house? The same kid you stole everything from. Honey, Where's the money, Mom? I interrupted, my voice cold, hard, sharp. Where's the money from the house? Silence. Then in a small voice she admitted. It's gone. I closed my eyes, a warm satisfaction burning in my chest. Of course it was gone. First-class flights, luxury hotels, shopping sprees in Paris and Rome. They had burned through nearly $500,000 in a matter of weeks, and now they had nothing left. I took a deep breath. So let me get this straight, I said slowly. You stole my house, sold it, spent the money, and now that Richard's homeless, you expect me to fix it? Her voice cracked. We made a mistake. A big one. I smiled. Yes, you did. And I hung up. That should have been the end of it. But Richard wasn't done yet. That night at exactly 11:47 p.m., I heard a pounding on my door. I went to the peephole. and there he was. Richard. His normally perfectly coiffed hair was a mess, his suit rumpled, his eyes bloodshot. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. I opened the door just enough to lean against the frame. "Richard," I said, my voice flat. He let out a shaky breath. "Ian, listen, I cut him off. Whatever you're about to ask, no." His jaw tightened. Just need some time. A place to stay while I laughed in his face. He flinched as if I'd slapped him. Then very slowly I leaned closer and whispered, "This isn't your house anymore, Richard." I watched as his face contorted. Anger, shame, desperation, all flickering across his expression in a matter of seconds. "You selfish little prick," he spat. I took a step back and slammed the door in his face. He started pounding on it hard. "Ian, you miserable, selfish little prick. You think this is funny? Let me in." I took another swig of my beer, calmly unfazed. "You really think this is going to work, Richard?" I said, my voice laced with amusement. "Save your energy for when the IRS starts knocking on your door." Silence. Then boom. He slammed against the door so hard the wood rattled. "Let me in. You never appreciated anything, did you?" I let out a heavy sigh. Without another word, I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. "Hello," I said, my voice perfectly calm. "There's a man outside my house trying to break in. He's yelling threats. No, he doesn't live here. Yes, I'd like someone to come and remove him." I peered out the window just in time to see Richard stumbling back from the door, looking around wildly. He was probably realizing he had about 5 minutes before he was arrested. He muttered something under his breath, and then shuffled off down the street like a defeated man. And that was the last time I saw his pathetic face in person. The final blow came in the following weeks. Richard's life completely unraveled. The IRS audit went ahead, and they didn't just find years of tax evasion, they found hidden offshore accounts, triggering a full-blown federal investigation. The fraud case moved forward, and my lawyer Sam destroyed Richard in the legal proceedings. Turns out, forging someone's signature on a mortgage document, that's highly illegal. My mother filed for divorce. Yep, the second she realized Richard was taking her down with him, she jumped ship, froze their joint accounts, hired her own lawyer, and kicked him to the curb for good. I'd love to say she did it because she finally grew a conscience, but she didn't. She did it because she was scared. She didn't bother contacting me, which was fine actually. Perfect, in fact. Because now Richard had nowhere to go. Where's Richard now? Here's the best part. I hadn't heard anything about Richard in months. But a few weeks ago, I ran into Uncle David at a coffee shop. We sat, chatted for a while, and finally I asked, "So where did Richard end up?" David grinned. "You're going to love this," he said. Turns out, after he lost everything, he tried to flee the country. Wait, really? I almost choked on my coffee. David laughed, shaking his head. Seriously. But there was one small problem. The IRS had already flagged his passport. So when he tried to board the plane, they arrested him right there, in front of everyone. Like the loser he always was. I laughed so hard I could barely breathe. "You're kidding." "Nope," David said, still chuckling. "Last I heard, he's trying to fight the charges. But between the fraud case, the tax evasion, and the mountain of debt, he's sunk." I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. It was finally over. Richard was finished. And me? Well, I got my money back. Not all of it, of course. The house was gone. But between the lawsuit settlement and the damages, I ended up with a nice chunk of change in the bank. My mother tried to apologize. She sent long, guilt-ridden texts. She left voicemails talking about how wrong she'd been, how she wanted to fix things. But I never replied. Because I realized something. She was never truly on my side. She'd been with Richard until he stopped being convenient, and I was just collateral damage. So I cut her out. For the first time, I had no family obligations, no guilt, no constant weight dragging me down. Just freedom. And man, did it feel good. Like I could finally, after so long, breathe again. A few months ago, I was homeless and betrayed. Now I have a new place, a fresh start. A bank account flush with Richard's money. And best of all, I sleep like a baby every night, because I know that somewhere in some cold prison cell, Richard is lying awake staring at the ceiling, wondering where it all went wrong. And that is the best revenge of all.